Welcome everybody to another video of Making Decisions. This one's going to be over filtering your data within a decisions flow. And there's three primary ways that we can do this. There's many ways you can do it, but I'm just going to show you three so that you have this in your decision skill toolbox. The first way is going to be using the fetch entity step. The fetch entity step is the basic query step in decisions where we can fetch data from a user-defined type or from a default type in decisions, and there's different ways we can fetch only certain data that we want and not the whole thing. The second way that we can do this is a rule collection filter step. It is just a step that has a rule tied to it that will go through every single item in the list and only grab the ones that you want. The third way is we're going to run a report that has a filter in it. So a third way we can do it is you create your data source in your report, you add a filter to only show travel requests in the set state completed, and then you run that report and get that data from the output of that report. So let's go ahead and show those three ways. I'm going to create a designer folder. I'm just going to call this filtering data in decisions, and then I'm going to add this at root, create, and then the next thing I'm going to do is let's create a flow, and it's going to be filter stuff flow. All right, so the first way we talked about is the fetch entity step. So I'm just going to type it in fetch entities to pop it up, and this is the fetch entity step that we frequently use, has many use cases. It's a step that you'll use a lot if you go to training, or a step if you're on the professional services team, you'll be using this step. So what does this step have? This step has the ability to select a type name. This is basically what is the data that you want to retrieve from it. So I'm going to use the accounts type, and I'm going to grab the account group. So it's just going to fetch all the accounts in my current system, and I'm going to connect this up. And you may be familiar with, if I just run this query the way it is, or run this step the way it is, it's going to fetch all the data. Start debugging. I got results. When I look at the output of this step, you can see that in my entity results, I have 18 items. And you can see the individual properties of those 18 items. Now, how do I filter this data? Well, what I can do is I can say, hey, I only want to get data based on if it was created by the admin user. So what I want to do to filter your data with the fetch entity step, you'll have this fetch criteria area right here. And if you want to add a filter parameter, you just click the add button right here, and then you can select the field name you want to filter by. So the account type in decisions has many properties. I think it has over 18. So the one I'm going to use, if I want to find all accounts that were created by the admin user, I'm going to select the created by. So I have the created by field. You can also adjust the query match type. Let's say it doesn't have to be equal exactly to the admin at decisions type, or email address. Then I could select contains, or if I want to find all the ones where it's not equal, not created by the admin user, I can use the does not equal or any of these other options here. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to just leave this as equals, but know that you have all those other options. So now notice what happens in this step. When I click off onto the white space canvas and then click back onto the step, notice that I have an input for this step. This is the input that was declared by my criteria, created by equals, so now I have an input called created by. This is a parameter. You can have all the default input mappings to it, set it as a constant, select it from a flow. You can use a merge plain text, run a converter. You have all the input options here. For the sake of this example, again, I'm just going to leave it as admin@decisions.com. Now, so what this step is doing, I'm going to click off the white canvas and then back on the step. Now, what this step is doing is it's saying, hey, I want to fetch all the data where the created by field equals admin@decisions.com. For those of you who may can write SQL, it's basically the equivalent of saying, hey, select from, or select email address, or I'm going to say select asterisk from dbo.entity_account, where created by equals admin@decisions.com, right? That's literally all this is doing, admin@decisions.com. That's literally all this is doing. It's just a simple select from where query in the back end. For those of you who are non-technical, you can just disregard this. It is just a way to filter your data to get the data that you want. So now when I run this step, notice what happens. I, instead of getting 18 results, now only have 15 items instead. So these are all accounts where the created by is admin@decisions.com. And there should be a lot of those because the admin@decisions.com is the default account that I log into. But let's say I want to filter the data even further. So I think if I use the system and say system, that's its own, that's the default system account in Decisions, I should get a even more filtered list, just to show you an even more filtered list. 3 items, right? So now I'm filtering my data based on a query parameter. Created by, and if I go down to the created by, where is that? Created by, here we go, system, and I can confirm that right here that it accurately fetched all the accounts created by the system. Cool, cool. All right, now let's go to the next one. So that's using the fetch entity step. One more call out to it is you also have this parent folder ID input. Now the parent folder ID didn't really have an application when I was fetching accounts, but here, let's say if I'm storing data in a particular folder, or let's say I want to retrieve folders that are inside of another folder or anything inside of that particular folder ID, I can pass that into this parent folder ID. What this does is it limits the fetch entity step to, instead of retrieving everything, it's only going to retrieve the type that you specified that's located in that specific folder. So that's what that means there. For the sake of time, I won't show it. I'm going to now transition to the other filter step, which is important to know, which is the rule collection, if I can spell, rule collection filter step. And I'm going to drag this on the canvas here. The rule collection step has 2 parts to it. You may have seen me use this in another video, but what happens is you can set this step up to take in a certain type. This could be a simple type, or you can use a user-defined type. And then you can configure what is the return. What do you want this filter to return to you? Do you want to return all the ones where it matches the rule, which we'll talk about in just a second? Do you want to return the ones that do not match the rule? Or, this is a really cool one, do you want to return the matches and non-matches? Now, from the initial thought of this, you may be thinking, okay, it returns the exact same list of non-matches and matches in the same list. What it actually does is if you click on this parameter, it actually will return your non-matches in their own separate list and return the matches in another list. So it kind of separates the data into 2 categories and 2 list variables, so you can manipulate them if you want. So that's a really cool option. For the sake of example, I'm just going to show the return matches because the application is the same once you understand the rule. Okay, so now what's going to happen is I can say, hey, let me go into this rule, and what's going to happen here is any list collection I pass into it. So it could be a string type, a user-defined type. If you're using a flow execution extension or case entity, you can pass this data into it and filter it. Now I'm just going to keep it simple. I'm going to leave it as a string, and I'll define a random string list. And so let's say in this list collection, before I get to that, I'm going to talk about the rule. So each rule collection filter has a rule tied to it. And what happens here is it says, hey, I'm going to run this rule against every single item within the list and check whether it fits the criteria or not. If it fits the criteria, because I have the input set up to return matches, it will say, hey, I'll add that in the list of matches I'll return. So what I'm going to do is I want to say, hey, I'm going to use the entity. Whenever you pass in a list of data, the entity is the individual iteration item that you want to evaluate against. So I'm going to keep this simple for the sake of demonstration. I'm going to say starts with, and I'm going to pass in a list of names, and I'm going to say the ones that start with the letter, let's do letter J, right? And I'm going to hit done. So now what's going to happen is it's going to take in a list of strings or a list of text and only return the ones that start with the letter J. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my create data step. And I'm just going to pass in a list of names. And this is going to be a list of names. This could be a list of whatever. I'm going to set this to a constant. So we'll do Kyle, Jason, Jared, Josiah, and then let's say we have Eric, Brian, Jada, Heath, and let's do Kirsten, right? So that's my list of names, right, that I have here. Now what I'm going to do is with this list of names, I want to filter out only the ones that have the letter J. So in this example, I should only be getting Jason, Jared, Josiah, and Jada, and everything else should be filtered out. So I'm going to select from flow and pass in those list of names in here. And then now when I debug this, so I'm going to set up a debug, start debugging. And now when I look at the rule collection filter step and look at the inputs and outputs, I can see that my input collection was the entire list, so that worked correctly. And then my output list is just Jason, Jared, Josiah, and Jada. Why? Because the rule that I configured said only retrieve the ones that start with the letter J. So this is just an easy example. If I did not want this to be a constant, I could have easily selected a flow variable if I've defined one in the flow designer, but just to keep it simple, I just left it as a constant. So I'm going to make sure I don't save this. So that's the rule collection filter step. It's pretty easy. You pass in a list of any type, a user defined or a simple type, and then you tell it what data you want returned from it, both the non-matches and the matches, or just the non-matches, and then you can do whatever you want to it later on down in the flow. That's the rule collection filter step. So that's number 2 on how we can filter indecisions. So now I'm going to delete this because we're not going to be using it. The final way to do filtering indecisions is the run report step. Now I do want to caveat, there's many ways you can filter stuff in decisions, right? There is a ton of ways. I'm just showing you these 3 just so you have this in your skills tool belt. But these aren't the only ways you can filter data. They're just one of many. So the run report step. Now let's say I'm going to use the accounts type again. So I'm going to drag over the run report step. I'm going to left click on the step, and then I'm actually going to create a report. I don't have one created, but I need to show this. So I'm going to create a new report. It's just going to be a normal report, and I'm going to call this the active accounts report. Create. And so now what I can do is I'm going to add my data source. It's going to be common. It's going to be the account data source. We're going to mess with that. And the ones I'm going to grab are going to be the fields I'm going to grab are going to be the email address, created by, created on, and then the email address. And let me organize that and put the email address at the top of the list. Apply. Okay. So now I have this. Now, let's say I want to filter this data out on accounts that are deactivated. I want to see all the deactivated accounts in my decision system. Well, I'm going to add a filter to this, the entity filter, and I'm going to add, actually not entity filter, field filter. I always get those confused. And I'm going to go to the is active section here. And then I'm going to say where is active is false, which means it's going to return all the accounts that are by default deactivated in your count. And as you can see here, my data just shows the guest account because that's the only account that's deactivated on my system. So now I have filtered out my data using a report. I'm going to save, and I'm going to close. Now, how do I use the run report step to grab data out of it, of that is filtered? So what I'm going to do is notice that the return option is set to Excel. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this to data rows. And what data rows does is it will output all of the rows from this report in a variable. So let me close this and go to my data explorer in a variable called report. And I can grab all the fields. Now remember, in my report, let me go back to edit the report. I have 3 fields. So I wish there was an annotation tool. So in the email address would be considered field 1. This would be considered field 2, and this would be considered field 3. That is important to remember because when I reference this data, let's say I have a form. I'm going to create a really quick form. And let's say I want to pass this data in here. And this is just example form. Let's say I want to pass in that report data onto a form. And so I'll have a text box for the email address. I'll have, this is going to be email. I'll have a text box for the email address. I'll have a date picker for the created on date. So this is created date. And then I'll have another text box for created by. There we go. And then I'll do created by. Created by. Awesome. Put that there. I'm going to leave my button just named button. Save and close. So now what I can do is now if I want to map in those values that are coming out of this report into the form, I need to remember those column orientations. So remember when I said that the edit report, this is field 1, this is field 2, and this is field 3. That's important because when I go to my form and I select the email address, I'm going to expand the report row and see where it says all field 1. I'm going to expand this, and then I'm going to get the, let's see, all text value, and I'm going to grab the first text value. So this is the path. I'm picking all of field 1 because that's where I've positioned my email address field. I'm going to get from all text value because I know it's a string or I know it's text, and then I'm going to grab the first. There's only one in that list, so it makes it easier. So I'm going to grab that because that's the only one that I need. If I want to do the created by, that is in field 2, so I'm going to say all field 2. I'm going to say it is also all text, and I'm going to grab the first because it's only one in this case, and then I can get that value there. Created on date. This one's going to be a little different because I'm going to say I want all of field 3, and then I'm going to want all date value, and then I'm going to want the first date, and then done. So that's how that works. Now when I debug this process, you'll see, boom, I have the guest account right here that's coming out of this run report step. I have the date, the created on date, and then I also have the system that was the account that created this email. So that is how I can utilize the run report to filter out the data I want and pass it into another decisions designer element if I want to display that. So that's why it is super helpful to know these 3 ways, right? The 3 ways that I've shown that you can filter are the fetch entity step, right? You can use your fetch entity step, add a fetch criteria and filter out that way. We've also shown how to use the rule collection filter step. If I can spell it, filter step. Where you can pass in a list of data and you can use the edit rule option to then filter out the data you want or don't want. And then you can also finally use the run report step where you can utilize the report designer by designing a report that has a filter on it and then changing the output of that report to output the data rows. I hope this was helpful. Please like, comment, subscribe in the bottom. It really does help. And also post any suggestions for videos that you like. All right, guys, you take care.